Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new It's a Progressive World interview. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by Derick Varn. Derick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, nice to be here.
So, Derick, I'm sure many of you know he was former teacher, if I'm not mistaken. We're going to get into his profile, but he's a professor, he's a writer, and we got to know him through his YouTube channel, which is really great. I've really been enjoying your solo vlogs, but we'll talk more about you in a few questions. But is there anything you want to mention? I can put
I
some
am
links.
technically both a professor, art lecturer, and a high school teacher.
Ah, okay. Very nice.
So
And a
I work at
poet,
a local community. Hmm?
and a poet's published, I believe, right? Poet.
Yeah, I'm a published poet. Yeah,
Yeah.
used to be an editor for Zero Books under Douglas Lane, and I used to edit for left-wing publications that have kind of long been forgotten now.
Mhm.
Like the North Star and stuff. It was a series of publications that came out right before the whole funneling of this nascent left into the Jacobin orbit. So while Jacobin was setting up like Jacobin reading groups and whatnot, I was working on a multi-tendency uh, Marxist magazine called the North Star, which was named after Peter Camejo's work, if you know who he was, one of the founders of the Green Party,
Ah,
former
okay.
Trotskyist who tried to bridge the difference between Trotskyist and Maoist in the 70s and ended up being primarily an environmental activist. And my tenure there was pretty um, controversial because we published this cycle of articles on what was then called call out culture, what we now might call cancel culture,
Mm.
although both those phrases are problematic. And call out culture has kind of gone away, and culture has kind of been co opted by the right as a major talking point. So it's a different thing now. But we published I think my primary claim to fame in left world is I'm the one who commissioned and published with a few other editors the Vampire Castle essay by Mark Fisher. So that's how I kind of got known on the stage, as addition to being a regular guest over on Zero. Not actually, it's for Zero Books, the original Diet Soap podcast. So
Wow.
that's my origins as far as like my relationship to left media. I have been a Marxist already for about 7, 8 years by that point. So I think I've been in the like far left world and milieu for about almost 2 decades. I took a brief stint where I kind of lost my mind and became a paleo conservative in reaction to the culture of the left. Something that I think I'm seeing a lot of people do now. They wouldn't call it that, but that's where they're headed. Um,
Is
and
paleoconservative basically racist conservative?
Sam, is your microphone right
uh,
there on you? Sorry, there.
Oh
I knew you
no, it
sounded
just
weird.
so
Okay, there.
sorry,
Sorry about
sorry.
that.
um, I one, I mean, if we're honest, most conservatives have some strange views of race. Two, Um, racialism and paleoconservatism is actually kind of interesting because in the aughts, that was not the gateway drug. The gateway drug was conservative opposition to the Iraq War. Um, and you had two options. You could either be a libertarian, which has never appealed to me because I understand economics. And an understanding of economics makes certain libertarian propositions really impossible to believe. Um, Particularly about the origins of property, which they're just, basically lying about. So, uh, but because of my that, um, the other option was paleoconservatism, which had a more muddled view on economics. Why I left, actually, if you mention race, is that it became pretty clear to me that most of the paleoconservatives were nationalists of some variety, and that their nationalism uh, tended to, although not always, ended up being based on either religion or race. There were some people who tried to be other kinds of civic nationalists, but it's very hard to do that and maintain a critique of the government at the same time. So you have a kind of cul-de-sac. But yeah, it put me into proximity of some shady characters before they got famous. So, for example, on my way out of
So
that
when was
world,
this approximately, like 3 4 years ago?
2001 to 2005. So,
Okay.
over 20
Oh,
years ago
quite
now.
young.
I'm older than I look.
Yeah, I was gonna
So,
say you've done a lot for a young person, but yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe
I'm in
you're
my 40s.
no way.
So, yeah.
Wow. You don't look it. You
Um,
look early
nice.
30s.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Um,
same age as us, I thought. So,
no,
but
I'm
all
older
right, so
than
you were
most of my,
older at 2000. Yeah.
yeah. So I was in my 20s. And before that, I had just been a working class kind of apolitical kid, but I got involved in the punk scene, which I was the punk scene
That
was
was fun.
in the 90s because it was kind of cross class as far as like a narrow section of the classes, but classes who in American life were pretty segregated otherwise. So like say upper middle class kids to relatively poor kids because getting involved in it was not particularly expensive.
But
Um,
were they political? Such people like involved in
yes and no. They thought they were political. I mean, that was the thing. Like,
like not conforming in that sense, political kind of.
yeah, and there was a lot of like flirtations with anarchism and stuff. So like from the zine culture, I knew who Murray Bookchin and Bob Black were in my teens,
Okay,
like
blah blah blah.
because people were talking about them in various magazines. Um, and I had discovered through that and through some email mailing lists that I would check at the library and at school. Um, I learned a lot about both kind of there was a when this thing got political, it kind of got weird. So, for example, there are a lot of discussions of Waco and Ruby Ridge, and then later on the OKC bombing when I was in high school in these circles. But there's also a lot of discussion of um, American foreign policy at that point, mostly in Iraq after the first Iraq War. Um, the beginnings of what looked like a kind of nascent aggressive foreign policy under Clinton with like the bombing of the Sudan medicine factory. So it was political in that way, but there was no real ideological cohesiveness to it at all. And we don't have the talking points back then that a lot of the left does now,
Mhm.
because one of the things that has changed, and it changed actually in my early 20s, was that the academic left became less cordoned off from general society because more and more people got educated, but couldn't get jobs, and because um, the internet had a lot of people adopting the terminology that was used in radical campus circles and like using them in the broader world. And that really changed a lot of things. So, for example, academic culture really changing the way, say, liberal journalists speak. That's a new thing. Like that's in the last 20 years. In the 90s, that did not really happen. Yes, there were liberal journalists, but they weren't using the kind of phraseology that you saw in academia. Like they weren't talking about heteronormativity in the pages of the Washington Post. Um, they might be trying to describe it in a very basic way. But anyway, I went to the battle for Seattle. I was 18 years old.
Was that
It was my
yeah, that was the one about the
Ward
world
Bank.
right?
yeah, it's about
Protest
the
against
G8 at the
yeah.
time. Um, and it was about the World Bank and deleveraging debt for the developing world. And that was my first exposure to like Trotskyist groups. That was my first exposure to more formal anarchist groups. That was the first exposure to people like Pat Buchanan, believe it or not. All that kind of happened at one time. And, I saw the black bloc. I saw this college kid culture, which I had not been exposed to because I was a relatively poor working class kid. Um, and I saw how kind of white the milieu was. Because I came from Macon, Georgia, which is about, I think now it's actually like 60, 70% black, but at the time it was probably about 50% black. And so going out west and going into Seattle, I was like, wow, like this is not what I thought it would be, given the rhetoric I hear out of these circles about anti-racism and whatever. I remember after the event, because there was some small technical victory made, everyone declared victory and kind of went home. And I was kind of disgusted, but I sat with it for a few years. I ended up homeless for a little while before I went to college. It's a different story, and kind of went through that. Got into college, encountered campus liberal culture, was deeply anti-war, so I was completely alienated from the Republicans, who were actually more common on campus at the time. I mean, one of the things I think people forgot, the guy that the movie Patch Adams was about came to our school and he suggested we read a Greb Palast book, and he got booed off stage at a college campus, like for not being pro-war enough. Um, that kind of thing at a state college would not happen now
Yeah.
at all. Um, in fact, if someone's getting booed off stage, it would be the other way around.
And
But
so
go ahead.
this is like post 2008 or
No, it's like
No, no,
2006?
2003, four, right?
this is like
It's
2000.
still
This is 2002,
for
2003. Yeah,
Yeah.
oh, so
right
all
after
right. Yeah,
9/11.
very early on. I was like,
Yeah,
okay,
this is in opposition to the Bush administration.
Yeah.
okay,
And I went to a protest. I think it must have been in 2003. It may have been in 2002, but it was an anti-war protest, also tied up in protesting the G8 at Sea Island in Georgia. And nobody showed up to it, but like these conservative anti-war activists. And that's how they got me, because I was very disgusted with the kind of hypocrisy of, what we can call postmodern humanities, like post-Marxism, hyper-liberalism, whatever you want to call it. And um, I was I was definitely responding to that because there was so much class coding in that stuff. Like you
Okay.
had to know how to speak a certain way,
Hmm.
and that was really important. Um, and I just viscerally reacted to it. So I was like, I'm going to protest this war in a way that I think is more reasonable, and that got me in Pat Buchanan circles. And what got me out was exposure to people like Joe Sobran, um, Sam Francis, early on when he was working at American Conservative, Richard Spencer. I think people forget that that was the case, that he used to work at American Conservative at one point. Um, before he went and joined the American Policy Institute (API), which sounds innocuous but is a super racist organization. And so I realized Stephen Molyneux, before he was a nationalist, like very early on, it was pretty clear he was trying to build some kind of weird libertarian cult. And it was very clear to me that the right was kind of insane during this time period, that if it was dissident, and it was clearly had racial overtones all over the place. Um, and I come from a multiracial family. I'm ethnically half Jewish, and so like I can't be in those circles. And I could start feeling around 2004, to kind of get you a good feeling of the time period, that something was wrong in the economy in a major way, that there was irrational building and irrational stock flows. I think the first thing was Enron, but I was working for an insurance company and like trying to figure out like the economic rationality of all these bundled assets and places building these big houses where there's not enough jobs to support them. Seeing, uh, seeing also all this actuarial aligning that disproportionately hit people of color, not because it was designed to. Like it wasn't designed by racists. In fact, my boss was from Morehouse.
Mhm.
Like, as a black guy who went to a historically black college, but because the compounding conditions of these neighborhoods over time meant that they were harder to insure, and you saw a feedback loop where you like kept the poor people poor. And between this irrational building and this like seeing of all these people literally gouging people for prices on for people in poverty and particularly people of color, I started to feel like we were going to see a major crash. And I started feeling this way around 2005, 2006. And that got me looking at theories of the business cycle. And the ones that I saw from, that I've been taught in school and that were common amongst the people I worked with, they were stupid, frankly. Like, um, the whole idea that, you'd have a contraction, it would fix itself through declining wages and less consumption. I didn't see that, nor did it make a whole lot of sense to think that it would just happen quickly. So I started digging into that. And that's actually how I came to Marx actually economically, not politically.
Mm.
And um, I wasn't pushed to be politically involved in Marxism until 2008. I had been involved with the Mike Gravel campaign very briefly. And of course he lost. I mean, we know this history, right? And he ends up going to the Libertarian Party, loses there too to Bob Barr. Whole weird story around that. I don't go with him to the Libertarian Party because my experience with paleo conservatives led me to think they were nuts. So, and libertarians were too adjacent to them. Um, so I stayed and hung out with the Democrats and moved my support to Barack Obama as the anti-Clinton candidate. Um, and as soon as Barack Obama appointed his cabinet, I felt betrayed, like immediately. Like, not that I really believed he was as progressive as a lot of people said he was. I'd looked at his votes in the Senate, and I read about his background, and I also figured as the first president, the first black president, the first any president of color, that he was going to have to be more conservative. Actually, just like institutionally, there was no way around that. But if you voted for him as part of an anti-Clintonite vote and to move away from the kind of war posturing of the DNC in the 90s, which I very much remembered having grown up as a teenager in that time period, um, seeing him appoint all those same people immediately to his cabinet was like, well, what was the point?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, Paul Volcker was even an advisor. I mean, like, come the fuck on. And am I allowed to swear in your podcast?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Definitely.
Sure,
good.
sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
so for me, that was a radicalizing moment, but I was in Middle Georgia at the time. Um, and so it was very hard to find anything like a left outlet. I had been exposed to like critiques of postmodernism from Marxist, in quotation marks, like Zizek, and this is early to
Right.
everybody else, Zizek. I mean, he'd been already been writing for 20 years at this point, but he was really becoming known in academic circles. Um, in America. So I kind of added those two things together and went looking for a Marxist group to join. And I didn't find one until I was out of the country for work. So the Great Recession happened, which I kind of predicted, but eventually it got to me. And I was a high school teacher at the time. Everyone beneath me got laid off, so
Mm.
I went into a PhD program to kind of avoid it. People do that.
People from
And
high school teachers got laid off during that time.
oh, tons. We
Wow.
25. Okay, so the beginning of the teacher shortage starts in this time period because they laid off 25% of the workforce in about 2007 to 2010.
Teachers, I had no
Um,
idea.
well, most of the U.S. Schools are funded by property taxes, and property taxes
Mm.
historically have not gone down in recessions. But when you have a property crash, and this was the first one we've seen in America since before the New Deal, really, um, that meant that there was no tax base for schools, so they had to lay off 25% of their workforce. Um, it never
Property
came back.
taxes.
Mhm.
Is property tax the same as the council tax, basically the tax you pay for your local municipal? It's like a local tax. I mean, it doesn't go to federal or
Yeah, yeah.
that
Yes.
thing.
I don't know how familiar you are with the weirdness of American tax structure because when people quote like
A
America has
little.
super low taxes, right? It's because they're only looking at federal taxes.
Hmm.
Not
The
the
great
state
ma
taxes, yeah.
Yeah, state and municipal taxes actually fund the great majority of what goes on in the United States, which is kind of unfortunate because states don't have currency sovereignty definitionally, so they can't like play with the currency to fix it. They have to tax and spend. So it means that you really do have to pay for it from a local tax base. And the way schools in most states, although not all states, is set up, is property valuation taxes. Um, so that's how you pay for the schools. And if there's a crash in
Yeah.
property valuation taxes, then there's no money to pay for the schools unless you get federal grants. This was during the Bush years. You're not getting that many federal grants to support schools. So you have this massive layoff in the school system, which I think people have forgotten about. It also led
Yeah,
to
I'd
this
never
is
heard
also,
of that. I mean, not that I've heard of everything, but I've
yeah,
never heard of that.
that was the beginning of the stagnation of teachers' wages too. So teachers' wages had roughly kept pace with inflation
Mm.
from the 70s up through the 90s. They kind of slowed a little bit with the kind of assault on them with charter schools and what they hit into 2000s really hard, but it was wiped out during um, the time period that I'm talking about. So that's when you really see teachers start making less and less money in real terms. I mean, I actually, in my case, I was making less money, and I'm not saying less money adjusted for inflation. I mean, literally less money because I've been furloughed so much when I left high school teaching in Georgia after 3 years than when I began.
Well,
Um, so that was really the end of teaching being any kind of safe middle class job. I had been a adjunct professor, a lecturer before that, but I mean, I made less money doing that than when I worked at Papa John's or as a prison guard.
yeah, because of the
So
hours and the pay, I guess.
Yeah.
I got paid $1,000 a class
Okay, and for like the entire year or
for the
per
entire
for entire
semester.
semester. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I guess you would
So
have one or two classes, or I
I
mean,
mean,
how many?
yeah,
Yeah.
I was teaching at three different universities,
Wow.
teaching 8 classes, but that was only like adding up to like 18K a year,
Yeah. Wow.
with no benefits whatsoever. And this is
Yeah.
before even Obamacare, so there's no way to get health insurance, etc.
Because you're not full time or anything, right? So they don't have to.
Yeah, so I quit doing that, and become a high school teacher. So that's how I got into high school teaching. I would love to pretend that it was a great passion. It became a great passion. That's why I came back to it. I chose to come back to it, but it didn't start that way. It was kind of out of a necessity. So, we're back in the deep past here, but I think that context is a lot of the context for what led to Occupy Wall Street, and that's when I became relevant.
Hmm.
Um, because even though I was abroad at the time, I had to get out of the situation. Um, in the United States, I took a job as a professor, as a full-time lecturer professor, so non-tenure track, but full-time at a university in Korea
Okay.
because I have a terminal degree, I have an MFA, but I don't. Um, there's too many of us, and so um, I went abroad because they needed people and they paid okay. I mean, in American dollars, it didn't look so great, but you realize the purchasing power,
Yeah.
you know, in other
Yeah.
countries, you're just like, oh, okay, I'm doing pretty well. Um, and so I did that for like 3 years and then got into international teaching because it actually paid better. Um,
So during
and
the
did that
Occupy
for
movement, you were
Korea.
abroad, you were in South Korea.
Yeah, and I was writing about it on a blog. I also participated in Occupy because one of the things that was weird about Occupy is it was everywhere. Like we had Occupy Yoedo, which was in Seoul,
Hmm.
which is the bankers district in
Interesting.
Seoul. There
Oh,
was Occupy Taipei. I actually
Oh,
physically
wow.
went to Taiwan and saw it.
it was
Um,
London version, I remember.
Yeah, there
yeah,
was in Toronto. I remember I was there back then, but I didn't even think that would go that far.
yeah. It was
Interesting.
it was it was everywhere. What happened in Korea is actually kind of funny. So Kim Jong-un had just come to power and he endorsed Occupy Yoido and it immediately stopped. And then the protests against bankers became very nationalistic and right-wing. Um,
Immediately
so
after his endorsement. So
yes.
that's
So
that's bad. That's sad.
so what you saw was this shift. Uh, we're off topic, but just to give you a little bit about Korean politics, there was kind of two forms of conservatism there. There was a Christian form that was more George W. Bush like, led by Lee Myung-bak, and then there was a Buddhist variety that was much more weird and paleo-conservative, although just as anti-labor, led by Park, the daughter of the 70s dictator. And she gets ousted in a scandal. But she came to
Mo
power when I
oh,
was in Korea. She she barely beat out the left candidate. But the left candidate in Korea is limited by the national security law on how left they can actually
Hmm.
be. And so there was, you got a feeling that there was kind of a reactionary movement going on there. One of the things about being abroad in this time period during Occupy and writing about it and participating in this stuff, and it's even more heated when the Syrian civil war starts, is that I started seeing Trump-like figures emerge in Europe and Asia that people weren't recognizing. So when people were like, "Oh, Trump is this big new thing,"
Hmm.
that was actually like, "No, this is just coming late to America, actually." Like this has already happened in a lot of other places. We've already seen
it's
Berlusconi. We've already
Berlusconi.
seen, yeah, we've already seen Urban. We've seen Pac. We've seen Duterte. We've seen all this already. Um, and so, uh, so I'm involved in that, and this is why a lot of people think I was in Europe because the left that spoke English that I could easily interface with was, people at international universities and people in Britain. And I wouldn't comment, particularly once I left South Korea, but in South Korea, you could be deported for being too politically active.
Hmm.
That's the worst that was going to happen to you, but it could happen. When I was in Mexico, um, you could get killed.
Yeah.
So you didn't talk about Mexican politics much because it was so tied up in the cartels.
Like
And when,
even tourists or not tourists, but even foreigners, like it was dangerous
yeah,
for them to talk.
yeah,
That bad? Oh wow, okay.
Especially about
yeah,
Mexican politics, you're saying, right? I mean, I guess if you
yeah,
spoke
yeah,
about
yeah.
the US or somewhere
No,
else,
they
they
don't give a
wouldn't.
shit
Yeah.
about you
Yeah.
talking about
Sure.
anywhere else.
Yeah.
But like if you talked about, because because the cartels and the Mexican government, they seem at war, but they're kind of not. I
Makes
don't know
sense.
how like to
That
say
makes
it.
sense.
Yeah, I mean,
Usually the case.
Um,
that
you
yeah,
know,
yeah. No, but
uh,
I didn't know it's such a sort of a. Do they have such control? Like just like in Islamic Republic, they can't do that. Like everybody talks about everything. So that's
But I
I'm
guess if you
I
become a
surprised.
mean,
prominent person, though, I mean, if you, I guess, make it into the media or get
Yeah,
spoken about,
fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
yeah, so Mexico, when I was living there, is one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist on the planet.
yeah,
And it wasn't because you get arrested; it's because you get killed. And you
yeah,
weren't killed by the government. I mean, or at least not formally.
Friends
yeah.
of government. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, are, factions of cartels making deals with corrupt local officials or whatever. One of the biggest examples of this, when this happened, this was exposed when I was in Mexico, was a bunch of students being found that were executed by the cartels that were basically executed at a local governor's behest because they were
Is this the bus one or
politically.
that's different?
Yeah,
That is that, yeah.
it's the best one. And what's fucked up about
What the
that?
hell is going on?
Yeah,
What the
You're
hell
far
is
away from Mexico, so I guess
yeah.
yeah, it's
you
just
keep track.
There was a bunch of students that died at a university in southern Mexico. What is messed up about that is in the identification of the bodies, which they did eventually find, they found a bunch of mass graves,
Yeah,
like, so
Oh.
that weren't the students.
But
So,
they were like political enemies of the governor or something? All right,
yes,
okay.
of a
I
regional
just
governor, and the cartels are the ones who killed them, not the
yeah,
government.
uh,
yeah. Yeah. I mean that's part of their
So,
duties.
right. So, um, and
Wow.
the U.S. government's tied up into that. Like I lived there during the Zetas and Aloha cartel war, and um, the Zetas were actually trained down the street from where I grew up at Fort Benning, um, and what used to be called the School of the Americas. I forget what it's called now, which is where they would train people to do anti-communist actions, but later on to do anti-narco actions. But they were actually in most cases ended up training narcos. So the leaders of the Zetas were part of an anti-narco force in Mexico that were trained in the United States that split off, and they were using counterinsurgency and insurgency tactics. So they were truly doing terror. Like they're the people who would go in and like wipe out every male in a neighborhood just to terrorize the neighborhood, as opposed to say the Sinaloa, that's El Chapo's people, if you don't know who that guy is. They acted like the mob. So if you didn't get in their way, they usually wouldn't mess with you. Um, but the way that it intersected with U.S. politics and the pressures of U.S. narco policy on this, and really kind of meant that there was so many ties to both governments that it was that there's kind of like a lumpen parastate going on. And one of the things that happened around that when I was living in Mexico, there was a bunch of teacher strikes in southern Mexico, but there was also this indigenous movement that was seeking to kick out a cartel from its area. Um, so you had what would be called indigenous self-defense forces, auto defense, yeah, in Spanish, and they ended up fighting with the Templar cartel, which is a very weird cartel, but and it's very bloody. Um, and the Federalists, which is like the federal police force, started suppressing the indigenous self-defense force as much as it was suppressing the cartels, which led to a kind of undeclared but de facto mini civil war in a state in southern Mexico. And it made it super dangerous to go through. Like foreigners would get killed there. It was a
Mm.
place that you did not go. Now, I say all this, but what's interesting about Mexico is where this cartel stuff is not going on. Mexico is safer than the U.S.
Yeah.
It's really when you're in the cartel uh, part, which are
Areas
mostly
of
close to the United States.
And there's specific states, right? It's not like there's a little bit in this state or a little bit in that state, if I understood.
It's Coahuila, Chihuahua, to some degree, Baja California, Michoacan, which is in the south, and it's a port city.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, to some degree, the area around some northern Chiapas, but Chiapas, Oaxaca, the Yucatan, Campeche, those are fairly safe areas. The rich part of North Mexico, so around Monterrey,
Hmm.
pretty safe. Um, what you don't want to be on is you don't want to be on a port or highway corridor into the United States. So I lived in Torreon, which is straight up in the road into Texas. It's 8 hours from Torreon into McClellan, Texas. And that area was for a little while like the seventh or eighth most violent area in the world.
Hmm. No.
Um, it's also the cartel violence is also super bad in Central America. And I mean, there I've even heard of like U.S. troops being involved and
Hmm.
picking sides. I've heard that definitely in the case of Honduras, but I can't confirm that. And that's not something that like I'm willing to talk more in detail about because I didn't witness it. Um, but
And it's reached
so
Ecuador now, apparently. I mean, sorry, because I mean, there was just the killing of the president, and then I just saw a little
yeah,
fact. They were saying
handed to them.
Ecuador had the most homicides last year, apparently.
mhm.
So, surpassing Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah, so all this is to say, um, that my experience of being outside of the United States was radicalizing, but I was also interfacing with Occupy groups and Marxist groups in the US. Um, I was tangentially involved with the Socialist Party, but when I was in Georgia, there was no local for me to join,
Hmm.
so I was just a fellow traveler. When I was abroad and thus couldn't fully join because you needed to be in the US to be a member. Um, I don't know if that's still true, but it was true at the time.
Yeah, I didn't
So
know
I
that
was,
the US had a socialist party, but I guess it was
yeah, well,
really
it's
small in
a,
some places.
the
And
US is
and
so, go ahead.
they ha they put restrictions on membership. They were like,
Well,
we don't want to, not too many people. We don't want too many people showing up.
well,
It's
they
like
wanted to have a
socialism is
local.
too.
They wanted to have a local, but yes, actually, most
Ah, okay.
Marxist parties in the United States have restrictions on membership. It's not
Uh,
easy to join most of them.
wow.
Jesus.
So the origins of the party I was in was the Socialist Party USA, the SPUSA. In the late 1960s, Max Chapman and Michael Harrington ended the historical Socialist Party in America, going back to Eugene Debs. It
Mhm.
kind of survived. It lost most of its members with the development of between the president election of Debs in 1919 and the beginning of the Communist Party of the United States. The Socialist Party lost most of its members. Um, Kind of split. Some became kind of right wing. A lot entered the Communist Party.
Hmm.
Um, but it existed as a party well into the 1960s.
Hmm.
A bunch of former Trotskyists entered it in I think the early 60s. And Max Shachtman and Michael Harrington killed it to encourage entry and cooperation and realignment with the Democratic Party, which was weird because it was hard to understand because the Communist Party was already in alignment with the Democratic Party from the Popular Front, which it never dropped. So it was like, okay, so the only socialist opposition party liquidated itself. That led to a split. One created the Social Democrats of the United States, not the Democratic Socialists that comes later, and the SPUSA, which is the party I was in. The one of those organizations, which was the one led by Michael Harrington in the 1980s, becomes the DSA, and the DSA
Hmm.
grows, becomes like a regional power base in New York, but never gets more than like 5,000 people until 2013,
Yeah.
2014, and that's when there's a major shift. Um, but the Socialist Party the Socialist Party of the United States of America was more radical. It would run its own candidates, or it would do a lot of times. Our candidate was also the Green Party candidate. That
Hmm.
happened a lot. Um, like Howie Hawkins in the United States was both a Socialist Party candidate and a Green Party candidate in 2020. Um,
Okay, I see it now.
so, but it was a mess. There was a bunch of fights between like radicals and old social democrats. Um, and it was very dominated from people who had been radicalized between the 60s and the 80s. Um, and there was a bunch of young people entering it and they had no culture for it. And even I, at the time we would joke that no one was a leftist much past college.
Hmm.
And I was in my 30s.
Still a joke. Yeah.
It's still kind of true too. Although less true now. And I was in my 30s, so I was old. But the next people, the majority of that party were like in their 50s to
Hmm.
70s. Um, so there's this big age tension clash. Um, and so a lot of people went to different groups. I was very dissatisfied, and I ended up in a group called the Platypus Affiliated Society, um, which was a kind of left critique group. I stayed in it for about 2 years, and but I didn't have anything really to do in it, and I didn't agree with a lot of its rhetoric. Even if I agreed with some of its critiques of the left, I didn't understand what it actually wanted. So I left that organization when I was in Mexico and started doing editing because I'm like, well, what am I going to do in a U.S. party or a socialist advocacy group when I'm not in the United States? It's better for me to write about this. And when I get back home to the States, if I ever get back home to the States, I will talk about my experiences abroad. And this gets more intense when I get to Egypt because I see the undoing of the Arab Spring. Like I'm there for that.
So you
The
get there at the
reinstatement.
end of it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
the reinstatement of the national security law. In fact, I saw the event um, that caused the reinstatement of the national security law, which is the bombing of a Coptic church. It was literally down the street from me, and I saw it from my apartment. Um, so that was my experience, and you didn't talk about Egyptian politics as a foreigner in Egypt. I know you think being foreigner was relatively safe, but an Italian student was kidnapped and tortured, and no one
Hmm.
ever figured out who, but it seemed pretty
Hmm.
clear they were writing about the government. Um, and he was found dead with his fingernails removed.
Jeez.
Um,
Yeah, Egypt
so
is it.
yeah, so this is during Egypt during the counter Arab Spring and the reestablishment of the now Morsi government.
Yeah.
So the so that's my political history in a nutshell. During this same time period, I also worked publishing books and working in left-wing publications. Increasingly got into podcasting. Um, Starting around 2011, 2012. First in philosophy podcast, actually, because it was kind of an adjunct to my job. And then from that, I started talking to Douglas Lane, got involved in the original Diet Soap, got involved in the original Pop the Left. There's been like four versions of that. And um, the rest is history. I've done a bunch of podcasts since then. But yeah,
Nice. And so were you ever involved with any right-wing political parties or no? Because I just want to see if you saw any differences between them and the left ones.
I was
And
I was
did
involved in right-wing political groups, but I was never involved in any right-wing political parties. And I know that sounds strange, but I was involved with advocating for antiwar.com. I worked with uh Conservatives Against the War. Um,
and were their behaviors very different, you would say, from the left-wing ones that you were involved with?
Because I
Or
think this ties well into our question that now that you're more on the left, and we saw your recent video and many of your videos on Varn vlog, which is a bit of I feel like a dissatisfaction with the state of left. So maybe you can just go into that through this.
so the right cultivates its talent better.
hmm,
Um, both the right that has funding and the right that doesn't. All right. They protect their own better. Um,
do they have less disagreements? Because I
no,
mean,
they have more
no. Oh,
disagreements
really?
actually.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the
Interesting. I
thing
would
that I
have
think
thought the
people
other, I would have
I
thought
yeah,
vouch
otherwise.
for that.
this is what people don't understand about the right. The right in America is more fractious than the left. The difference is the right understands a united front. So what do I mean by that? They don't all support each other. They don't all give
Hmm.
each other money. But when it comes to a candidate, you normally will shut the fuck up and get in line.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Except when there's a kind of civil war in the movement. During the Bush years and the ascendance of neoconservatism, there was a civil war in the right wing movement, and it took a long time for a figure like Trump to get the paleo conservatives back into the game because they were kind of out in the wilderness. They were part of the early Reagan coalition, but they were increasingly sidelined during the Reagan years for the moral majority, for libertarians, for the Chamber of Commerce, etc. Um, and then you saw this kind of, if you were looking at like the weird Republican primaries in the 90s, and it's really hard to remember this stuff, but you had like before Pat Buchanan ran and formed his own, took over Nader's party, which is kind of funny.
Sure.
Um, and also, that's the first Donald Trump campaign is in that party. So there was literally a Pat Buchanan versus Donald Trump Reform Party uh, ticket one year internal to that party in 2000. But
Did
2000 or
Trump
2004.
actually run, or he just
No,
teased?
he ran. He
Really?
ran as part of the
Ah,
Reform Party. When he was leaving the Democrats before he became a
Okay, yeah,
Republican.
that's when he was, yeah.
because he teased many times, but I forgot. Yeah, he
Yeah,
actually teased.
He ran as an opposition candidate to Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan won the nomination. What is interesting about the Reform Party is that's Nader's party, but it took a kind of right-wing turn in the end of the 90s. Um, well, kind of after, everybody throwing everything behind Ross Perot, if you remember that guy.
Yeah, sure,
Um,
yeah.
so,
Funny. Sorry.
so, but that right was kind of out in the wilderness because if you were so I guess I technically was a member of Reform Party when I was 20. I consider, although at that time I did not consider myself a conservative yet, but they didn't do anything. It was like just something you could register on a
Hmm.
on a ballot. Like there was no like organizing or anything like that. All the organizing was done through like other groups. Um, and so I knew a lot of right wingers. I worked with them on anti-war stuff. Um, and because of it, I was also exposed to leftists all the time, particularly Cold Peak and International Answer and stuff like that. Um, but there was vicious debates on the right. Um,
That's really interesting, but I
and
guess you're saying when they need to come together or over certain things, they do it. Whereas, I mean, the left, it kind of seems to me right now, I mean, not the Democratic Party, but the left. I mean, if there's one issue that you kind of don't agree on, I mean, that's it. That's the kind of the end of that affiliation, it seems.
yeah, leftists going all the way back to I think 1918 and the 21 conditions in joining the Third International, the Comintern. Uh, and the in 1921, the beginning of the faction bang in the Bolshevik Party. It means that they don't broke disagreement. Like if you're
Hmm.
not in unanimous agreement or not willing to subjugate yourself to the will of the party, um, that you have to break. And while that's, most obvious in Trotskyist where there's breaks all the time, this is also true for Marxist Leninist parties. Like, why are there so many Marxist Leninist parties in the state when the CPUSA exists? It's because you have to split over a disagreement. Um, and I also think there's some kind of moral psychology difference there because there's a difference in what you're trying to achieve. Um, most conservatives, although this was not true for paleo conservatives, and so that actually is a way in which they were more like the left, are defending a status quo.
Hmm.
Paleo conservatives actually wanted to overthrow a status quo, like, but what they want to overthrow it to is basically the 1950s. So, it's Eisenhower's America. Or if you're really on the paleo conservative end, it's like the 1910s,
Hmm.
um, which is pre-New Deal. But the division of paleo conservatives, even within themselves, and these are huge questions, like how do you feel about the welfare state? A lot of paleo conservatives are fine with it. Some are not. Some want to get rid of it and go back to like civic organizations. And so that leads to a split between the kind of Pat Buchanan paleo conservatives, or what we would now call national conservatives, and paleo libertarians like Lou Rockwell. Ron Paul is probably the most famous one who ever had any influence on anything. Um, that group. And then that's opposed to, say, your average libertarian who is totally fine with modern moral norms, just doesn't want the government involved. And that's like the Libertarian Party in the United States. So there's a huge division there. There's also kind of another thing that's different is conservative ideologies don't tend to be worked out. By that I mean like there's not consistency. So the same person in a conservative movement might be an Ayn Randian one year, a
Hmm.
Trumpist another, a neoconservative another, and then they might be in the Pat Buchanan in the course of their life because they're kind of going with their gut feeling. And so their feelings about economics, etc., kind of break down. The consistency to conservatism that we saw in the post Reagan was really only on economics. That was the only thing they agreed on, and the paleo conservatives didn't agree with that. And so that, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, they were like, "Why do we need all this military spending? Our major enemy is gone." And so that was a big issue there. Um, but some things that are different, legitimately different. Um, I'm going to say something controversial. There are more women in conservative spaces, even though conservative spaces tend to be, particularly the far right ones, tend to
Yeah,
be misogynistic and reactionary.
I
Um,
can see
A
that.
lot of a lot of patriarchy and misogyny comes from women themselves. It's like just like any ideology, just it's
yeah,
just
it's
equally
self-enforced.
distributed. Yeah. So.
Um, but also like because it's tied into churches and to family norms, because conservatives are more likely to have children, etc. There were
Support
more
family.
women in those. Yeah, there were more women in those spaces.
Okay.
Um, it is less white than people think.
Yeah,
I will
yeah.
say that to you. It's still majority right, but more than the left. But then again, progressivism in the United States, not, I know your show is called It's a Progressive World. So, but in the United States context, the widest political movement is progressives, even though you wouldn't know that from who they choose as their representation. Um, that's that's distorting. Like that's an attempt to change the perception of the demographics of the progressive movement is to attract people of color. It doesn't work, by the way. I mean, that's part of the problem. So you have these groups that have all black and female or all people of color and female
Hmm.
BIPOC leadership and a lot of women in it. But if you look at their organization membership, it's like 80 to 90% men.
Yeah, no, I
White
mean
men.
that makes sense. I guess if you kind of put it together with maybe the people who went to university in the 80s or 90s, or I mean, even if you look at during Trump era, I mean, they would say, "Oh, there are like this many Latinos who actually support Trump," and they would find it surprising, whereas it's not.
Yeah, which it
They can
doesn't
be
surprise me at
conservative.
all.
Yeah.
Like, like I'm like, okay, so uh, one of the things I'll say about Latinos is just like those are wildly different ethnic groups that we call by the same name.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah, when you say they're less white than people think, the conservative groups, like in America, I mean, I don't know this, that's why I'm asking. Is it they're less black than like left-wing groups? Do they just have more Hispanic people, or no, do they have black people too? Because there seems to be something special about the way black people are like categorized in the US
Okay, so
especially.
there's a long history here that I need to get into. Um, the party of the black community until the New Deal were Republicans. That changes with the
Oh,
New Deal, but not in the South at first.
Yeah.
So the majority of black voters supported um, uh, Roosevelt in his second term, not in his first. But you have to remember that most black people were in the South, and most Southern black people could not vote because you're under black codes and Jim Crow laws. So we don't know what the opinion of the average black Southerner would have been historically. We don't have that data,
mm.
basically. Um, when Jim Crow's undone, there's this weird shift when Goldwater decides not to support the Civil Rights Act as uh, as an expression of what he saw freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. And he saw that, he had no problem with the government enforcing non-discrimination laws upon itself, but if you enforce non-discrimination stuff to the general public, it's forcing
Mm.
people to choose it forces people to associate with people they don't want to associate with. I mean, he probably was also some racist stuff going on there, and I'm not going to claim that there's not, but that's his intellectual justification for it. That finalizes the switch of the parties. All right. Nixon does this weird thing where he pushes the Southern strategy, picking up on Goldwater, but he also reaches out to the black community. Like Alex
It,
Haley, the guy who wrote Malcolm X's biography, was a Nixonite. So there was this attempt by Nixon. Nixon was basically trying to save the GOP by throwing basically spaghetti against the wall. Um,
so reach out to everybody, I think, at some point.
so from the 70s through the 2000s, though, the South is still Democratic. And I know that doesn't seem the case now, but like we had Democratic governors when I was a kid.
Mm.
But these Democrats were Dixiecrats. They were not pro social welfare. They'd make some concessions to it. They were anti black. They supported segregation. You started seeing between the 60s and the 80s, you saw nationally Democrats who were part of this Dixiecrat movement turn over to the Republicans, but on the state level, that didn't happen until the 2000s in the election of George W. Bush. Um, so in my state, for example, the legislature went from Democratic to Republican, but there wasn't a change in most of the legislatures. It wasn't like they were voted out. They literally just changed their party
Oh, really?
affiliation. Yeah.
Switched. Great.
Yeah, they just switched. That created an interesting and negotiated situation in the Black community. Um, so there was this Dixiecrat party machine in most of these cities in the South that existed that had just been abandoned by these people changing to the GOP. And there was, and so basically there was kind of a lot of backdoor dealing between the Black congressional caucuses and these new conservatives, giving these Dixiecrat political machines to the Black community, and creating like Black districts, but often at the expense of having more progressive Democrats in state legislatures. So that was a deal that was made. There's ProPublica articles about it from 2009 to 2012, but this really happened 10 years prior to that. The other complicating factor is in the South, and this actually does affect in raw number more white people than Black people, but in proportional number, way more Black people. If you've ever been a felon, you can't vote for the rest of your life. So about 1/3 of Black men in southern states can't vote
Wow, a third.
ever.
Jeez.
About a third. Um, and most of these are for drug crimes. It's not for violent crimes. So that means that um, educated Black female opinion, and one of the interesting things about the Black community that's different from other minority groups in the United States is women are more likely to be educated than men. All right, that's not true for Asians and Latino and Latins. I don't know. The cultural reasons for that are complicated, and I feel like anything I would speculate on it would be in danger of being racist. So I just want to say like it's just a statistical fact.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It
I
happens a
think.
lot in poor
Go ahead.
communities because in Iran, men tend to be able to earn much more money if they don't get educated, sort of
That's
basically.
probably the case too. The weird outlier is the Latin community, and with the case with like Asian Americans, be they Middle Eastern or East Asian or Southeast Asian, um, and for African immigrants, so Americans from Africa, not Black Americans who are descendants of former slaves. Um, Most of those people are not allowed in this country unless they are already middle class or rich. So you don't have a poverty pattern. So I think that explains that. I don't know that I don't want to speculate really on the difference between the Latin and the um,
Fair enough.
Black community and the indigenous community. College education is just super,
Yeah,
super,
I was gonna
super,
say
super
that's like a different
rare.
story. Right?
Yeah, it's an even more depressing
Yeah.
story than the Black case. What is interesting about that, though, and this is not actually talked about very much, um, in so much that indigenous people vote in the United States, they tend to vote Republican.
Hmm.
Um,
And
uh,
that's one group you never hear about. I mean,
But
what
are they?
percentage of Americans
Yeah.
are indigenous Americans? Is it like less
two
than five?
percent if you
Okay,
two
yeah.
percent if you include Pacific Islanders, Hawaiians,
Mm-hmm.
and Native Alaskans, Inuit, etc. If you deal with the historic tribes, probably less than 1%. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
and yeah, I mean, part of the problem is indigenous ancestry in the United States has been, um, like, yes, there's a lot of like white people claiming to be Cherokee princesses, and that's totally bullshit. But there's
yeah.
also a lot of real like
I mean, Elizabeth
resident,
Warren, the real.
yeah, exactly. But there's also a lot of white people who are descendants of people who were residential schooled and basically adopted by white families and
Mm-hmm.
groomed into white culture, and they weren't killed, but they were culturally erased.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's kind of a problem here. The other problem is the tribes don't get to decide their own criterion for membership. It's decided by blood quotient, which is about as racial as it sounds like it is.
So if you're part
And
of a
so,
certain ethnicity, I mean, a particular sect of indigenous, so it's based
well,
on
if you're
that.
part of a certain, if you are a tribe, your tribal status is based on your blood quotient, which is based on how many tribal ancestors you can identify and prove.
Okay. And the more you have, the better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you want tribal
Yeah.
affiliation,
Okay.
tribes had their own ways of picking membership
Hmm.
in the past, and they would adopt people and whatnot. But federal, like depending on which of the treaties you're subject to in the United States, it varies how you can decide tribal membership. But regardless, at the most uh, expansive definition is 2% of the population, and it is by far the poorest percent of the population. And um, there are there are places in the reservations that don't have consistent running water because it takes an act of Congress to get it. So like it's I've spent some time on the reses. It's rough. So people don't talk about them. They don't really affect much politically. I mean, I hate to say that,
Yeah,
but
yeah, I know, but
they don't. Indigenous communities tend to be, more radical on on certain questions of like land, pipelines, stuff like that. But they don't tend to vote that way.
hmm
There are specific nations where that's not the case. So the Diné Nation, or what we call what's commonly called in English the Navajo Nation, they tend to vote Democratic now, but the actual voting patterns of the res tend to be Republican, and that's frankly because they're rural.
hmm
Like, it's rural poverty. Um, Democratic urban development doesn't tend to deal with that. Nor until very recently have they given indigenous people any representation. So why would they support the Democrats? And why would the Democrats care? It's so small a portion of the population that
Yeah.
it really doesn't change anything.
Yeah, spread between the states and all this. I mean, just
But your
mm,
question about black people, to answer your question, there is a group of black male
Mm.
conservatives, um, and that group is growing, all right, significantly. But you're right. When you talk about people of color on the right, you're talking about South Asians, Latin people, Middle Easterners sometimes, although that's newish because there was so much anti-Middle Eastern xenophobia for so long on the
hmm
right. And it's still there, but it's no longer the primary form of bigotry. Um, and so you see a lot of that, and increasingly more of that, and even on the far right. Um, the GOP, it is kind of tied to evangelicals, and there are two kinds of evangelicals in America, basically, white and black. And black evangelicals are tied into um, the Democratic Party, and white
okay.
evangelicals, which are significantly a larger group, are tied into the Republican Party increasingly. During the moral majority and during the 70s and 80s, it actually wasn't true. There was the spread of evangelical Christians was actually roughly like Catholics today, for example, in the United States. The percentages of Catholics who are Republicans and Democrats actually mirror the percentages of the country.
Mm.
Like so, like I think it's like 52% Democrat, 37% Republicans, and there's actually more moderate Catholics who are independents than there are in the general population. Um, I think with evangelicals, it's like 60% Republican, and with Mormons, it's 70% Republican. And if you look at if you break it out by race, it's even more extreme. So I think it becomes like 80% or more. I've seen different statistics on that, so I'm a little bit uncomfortable like saying that for sure, but it's a lot. Um, but the thing you have to remember is that the evangelical movement has been declining rapidly in the last 20 years. Like, so it was growing, 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 growing until the beginning of the aughts. And then basically after 9/11, churches started to die, and then they really started to die in the economic downturn. So um, people under, I think it's 35, are only like 50% likely to be any kind of religious at all. And people over 35 are like 70% Christian. So that's a very different, like the religious spread in the United States is now also the age spread.
Hmm.
And that's gonna be very, very weird. One of the things that I can think we can say about the right in the United States is it's become more racialist as it's become less religious. Um, but at the same time, there's this counter tendency to move beyond white nationalism and start promoting Western nationalism that is more inclusive, like basically, what liberals would say cultural whiteness, but I think that's kind of ridiculous because these people would not recognize themselves as adopting white culture, but they're like, no, but we're participating in American culture. Um, and that culture has at times been white, but it doesn't need to be. And so that's been the way that as things secularize, the right has been able to reappeal to Latin and Asian voters. Now, here's something most people don't know: the majority of Asians uh, in America and the majority of Latin immigrants in America before 2006 were Republicans anyway.
Hmm.
The everybody, the all POC being Democrats thing is a second half of the Bush administration, the beginning of the immigration talks and the kind of anti-immigration turn um, in the late aughts. Um, and that is interestingly what Trump did is somehow be able to maintain that anti-immigration stance, but appeal to people of color. And I think
Yeah.
part of that has to do with the fact Democrats haven't fixed anything about immigration, not at all. So um, the if that's something Latin voters care about, well, the Democrats aren't going to fix it anyway. So why care? And when you look at the differences, I don't mean to be a purely economic determinist, but if you look at differences, not just in where people live, but where people work in the United States, um, a great majority of black men work for the federal government because it's easier to prove our state governments, but places are overseen by fairly strict, uh, hiring rules, no nepotism rules, etc. So, like, if you were a black middle class person, and particularly a man, your best jobs were the municipal works in the city, the water works, the post office, the DMV, um, and because you got good benefits and they were actually good about not discriminating. Um, Latin people didn't have that advantage for one simple reason: they often don't speak English.
Hmm.
So a whole lot of particularly first generation Latin immigrants, um, they go into small business. So they own their own, but they're kind of petty bourgeoisie. Um, their alliance with the Democrats seems to have been um, mostly on immigration and to some degree some social welfare. But as particularly during COVID, a lot of the Latin small business owners just gave up on the Democrats entirely. So it's uh, it's unclear if that's going to change. And the Democrats for a generation have been basically saying we're going to be politically dominant because of racial trends, which while it is a batshit conspiracy, the white replacement theory actually comes from right wingers listening to Democrats say that over and
Mhm.
over and over again for 10 years.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
Now, like I said, it's a bullshit
Yeah.
racist conspiracy theory, but it does come from Democratic rhetoric.
Gonna ask if you like about now uh, your dissatisfaction with the left now. We watched your recent video, the post burnout thing, which is like post, I guess, dissatisfaction with the Bernie group and all that. So I thought, yeah.
So my dissatisfaction with the left now
And who are you talking
comes.
about exactly by the
Yeah,
left
that's
right
always
now?
a good question, right? Because the left is a floating signifier right now. So
Yeah, I didn't
even
want to
people,
get too controversial. But Camille, no, sorry,
So
go ahead.
one of the things that you have to deal with is that I don't think we can choose. I don't think we get to choose what movement we have. Like, so I can't say if you're a Democrat, you're not a leftist, right? Personally, I would love to say that, but um, I can't say that for a variety of reasons because it's a muddled spectrum. And actually, the seeming repopularization of socialism has made it worse, not better.
Much more
Um,
muddled for sure.
it's much more muddled because one of the reasons why I have no proof for this, but this is my gut instinct about why socialism became popular.
So in like 2000 Bernie time.
Yeah, before Bernie. So
Mhm.
between like 2008 and 2016, why were millennials so willing to consider socialism?
No good jobs, I think.
Economic conditions and also everything that tried to fix those economic conditions, even if it was explicitly capitalist, got called socialist no matter what. So, like,
Mm.
conservatives would call everything socialist, Social Security
Mhm.
socialist, every public service but the military socialist. Um, and
Yeah,
Bernie
you're right.
and I hated this by the way, but I get why he did it. He just adopted that in 2016 campaign, like the post office is socialism. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I could see
and
the
Right.
strategy. It was like in a way, but yeah.
yeah, I mean, and there is a way in which yes,
Mhm.
public
Can
goods
interpret.
uh,
Yeah.
is kind of like the backdoor way into socializing things or at least nationalizing them, right? And as a strict Marxist, I actually point out nationalization and socialization aren't the same thing. Um, but uh, this has made it very hard to tell where socialists begin and where just regular old 90s and 80s progressives end. It's even harder now. Um, it's kind of getting clarified, but it's getting clarified for reasons that are unfortunate. So one of the things that's happened is between 2018 and 2022, socialism became less popular again. It is not unpopular like it was between, say, 1952 and 2007, where it was a swear word. I mean, I remember, for example, when I first became a Marxist, I would never call myself a socialist or communist. Like it was like we're just going to keep that quiet. Like I was even careful about calling myself a Marxist. I would say something like, "Well, I'm Marxian," right? And yeah, that
I've
was
seen his
code,
books. They are nice.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like Marx had some good ideas. We're going to avoid the Soviet Union. Um,
Mm.
and not even because I thought the Soviet Union was all bad. I just didn't want to deal with it, right? Like
Mhm.
it's just like at that time the
The
baggage was
reaction.
too high. Yeah, and I had lived through the fall of the Soviet Union. I think people forget that. In fact, my first trip outside of the United States that wasn't to Canada through my father. My father had dual citizenship, so he was kind of a a salesman drifter who would go back and forth between the two countries. But my was I got a scholarship to Germany for study abroad for 6 months, and I had no money. I was so fucking poor.
Mhm.
Um, and because I was poor, and it was like the year 2000, we would always go to the former Soviet bloc when we left on the weekends because it was just so much cheaper than Germany. I mean, this is still before the euro, but we would go to like Prague. And the shit I would hear about the Soviet Union in Prague in 2000, all right, it's very different than what I probably hear now, for example, um, was and in Poland was really, really bad. And I had no reason not to believe it, right? Like, so um, that kind of just like, okay, we're just not going to deal with the Soviet Union. And um, my experience of China was that it was super market driven and it didn't even have socialized medicine.
Mhm.
So like which it kind of does now a little bit, but in the 90s and aughts it definitely didn't. And so I was kind of like, well, socialism and communism, like they're they're not dead, but the only places that have them are like these holdout states, and places like Bolivia and Venezuela are kind of trying it, but they're hemmed in by international stuff. And they keep on having to liberalize certain market relations, and so why would I, invite that on myself? The Hugo Chavez resistance to a coup in the aughts um, started softening me towards that position, but it was still, we kept it secret, right?
Mhm.
Now it's completely different. Like you're just like, you know, to be a Marxist on the internet is cool. But one of the things I'll say about that is what it is much more muddled than what it was. And a lot of people didn't really change ideologies. They changed what they called what they already believed.
Mm.
And now we're seeing, even in the DSA had a convention this weekend, and a lot of the more radical caucuses won. Um, so we're seeing radicalization of Marxists again, some of it vulgar, some of it not. Um, but that's actually a sign of decline. So what do I mean by that? Less and less people identify as Marxists, so it's easier to take more radical positions again. Because in the 80s and 90s and aughts, if you were a Marxist, you took some of the most radical positions you possibly could, because how else are you going to get attention? I mean, people forget this, but there was like the Spartacus League, which is a atrocities group in the United States, claiming to have critical support for Al Qaeda. Like it
Ooh.
was crazy. Like and
I
actually
forgot about that.
it was part of why I wasn't I moved away from the left in my early 20s, but it was part of it's this postmodern like liberal condescension. But part of it was also like, well, when I meet Marxists, they're fucking crazy. So like like it is it's very hard to feel like that wasn't attractive to me or most of anyone who wasn't highly alienated and very young. Um, so that's different. Where does it lead now? It's hard to say. The one thing we can say for sure is that while you did get some concessions in rhetoric from the Biden administration, by and large, most of the progressive policies the Biden administration actually pursued were under Trump initiated emergency statuses. While he, maybe expanded them in some ways, he contracted them in others, um, and owned them in a way Trump couldn't. Um, it's not even clear that the social democratic policies that we kind of had for 2 years here were even a result of the Democratic Party. They were a result of a crisis. Um, because
Definitely
there's
like
a
the
content,
student loans and all that kind of stuff.
yeah, there's a continuity between the the end of the Trump regime and the beginning of the Biden regime that frankly no one really wants to address in the mainstream of the American political system because it makes everyone look bad.
Yeah.
Um, because there really isn't that much different other than Trump's antagonism towards and even this was mostly rhetorical.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say
Um,
his early rhetorics, you mean, like
yeah,
when he first launched his campaign. I mean,
and then the conspiracy mongering
mhm.
around the election. One of the things that I will point out though, and this will make me unpopular, is conspiracy mongering about U.S. elections has been a tendency now for 20 years. And while it is majoritarily Republican, it has not just been Republican. I don't just mean Russiagate. I mean, Russiagate's like kind of the most obvious one where there's some real stuff going on, but most of it's expanded into like paranoid bullshit.
Yeah.
Um, I also mean, for example, people claiming that bad election machines gave Bush the
2001,
election in 2004,
Florida.
not in 2001. 2001 was like it's pretty obvious that the Supreme
Definitely.
Court,
Mm.
yeah, gave the election to George Bush. But 2004 is the only time in 20 years where the Republicans have run the popular vote. But I think they really won it because it is after 9/11 and it's in that context, right? Um, Whereas there was a minority of Democrats, particularly like Greg Palast, and these were not people who were marginalized. These are people who work for The Guardian and and whatnot. This is before there was really a liberal news outlet like MSNBC in the United States, um, who were claiming that the 2004 election was also stolen. So, and then you think about the conspiracies around Barack Obama, which wasn't that he stole the election, but he wasn't actually fit to run. Um, all the birth certificate stuff. Um, And so what you see now is 20 years of increasingly escalating and increasingly partisanly believed claims of election fraud. And that has not been dealt with in a way that uh, belies any. I don't think. I think that that's going to be a serious problem in the future. Because eventually we're going to have an election where even the military doesn't really know or agree on who really won it.
That would be scary.
And yeah, and one of the reasons why that's hard to fix is the US Constitution makes even federal elections state law province. So there's not consistent election law in the United States. There's 50 different election laws, even for federal governmental positions. There are some federal court rulings that limit that, like you can't disenfranchise people anymore, you can't deny people the vote off of race, etc. But those are limitations to what states can do. They
Yeah.
don't tell them, they don't tell them how to do it.
Exactly. Mhm.
So they can
So
vote
yeah,
however they want or have, yeah, I guess, count
You
them
can
in
hold
different ways
elections
and
on in a
time.
morning
yeah, yeah, yeah.
between
So
7 to 8 if you show up.
right, I mean, um, what we're likely to see is increasingly people feel like they're not representative, and they also don't trust the media anymore. And I think rightly. I mean, the beginning of that, it goes all the way back to Watergate, but it really kicks up after the second Iraq War, because the media was just repeating what the Bush administration was saying verbatim and didn't question it at all. Like, and that's when like Americans also, this is in the height of the beginnings of like the internet being cheap and readily available to people. So you could also get news from places outside the United States, and that didn't work anymore. So like everybody was reading British news in the United States during that time period because it gave you a different perspective. And so um but that's led to a massive level of social distrust because you have a highly distrustful society with high levels of inequality and opaqueness to public opinion. So, for example, there's been study after study after study going back now 20 years, all the way into the 90s. It says like popular opinion has very little effect on legislation, like at all. Particularly after you got rid of pork spending. So the ability for people to put stupid like local stuff into bills to make compromises. Um, and the reason why that is like donors really decide more than um, voters how these representatives stay in office because they draw their own election maps. So increasingly over the past 30 years, elections are not competitive. Like this is a Democratic stronghold, this is a
Yeah.
Republican stronghold, and it's just like unless you have a primary challenge, it will not change.
And so, having seen your show a lot, can we say kind of conservatives, the original sort of uh, philosophers, elite, Italian elitist school, that type of thing, they were proven kind of right. Like we cannot have basically a large scale collective action due to, I don't know, iron law of oligarchy, irrational basis of community. That
I my belief in that, and thank you for listening to that on elite theory, is that I
I
don't think
love
it's
that.
an iron law. There are things you can do to fight it, but if you don't fight it, it will happen. So it's kind of like the tragedy of the commons is another example of this. The tragedy of commons, most people work out how to handle without private property or government intervention. Um, but if you don't work that out, then yes, the worst case scenario will happen. There are ways to mitigate against the iron law of oligarchy. However, there's two problems that you're going to have that make it the most likely outcome. One,
Mhm.
to fight it requires active political engagement that is consistent over time. And two, you have to resist bureaucratization. But most people don't want to resist bureaucratization because it means that they are going to have to do it. Like, so one of the things that I've pointed out to people, if you want better police and military, then everybody needs to do that job. And I do mean everybody. Um,
What do you mean by that?
I mean universal civil service.
Hmm.
Um, what do I mean by that? Because one, the job is inherently corrupting, and two, if not everyone does it and you don't have a fairly constant changeover, um, and most of the people involved, while you do lose some skills, you will lose a little bit of skill efficiency. I'm not going to lie about that. But you'll have the accumulation of bureaucratic power that's very hard to fight. Why is it so hard to prosecute cops for crimes?
How many people want to be cops?
Not many right now, right?
Well, ever.
However, well, a lot because it's a secure middle class job. It's a
All
dangerous
right.
middle class job. Um, there are all kinds of psychological studies on like how cops abuse their families and whatnot. One of the things that's not answered by those studies is that because of who's attracted to being a cop, or is
Hmm.
that because what cops see and do all the time? And if it's the latter, then that's not a job you want someone doing for long periods of time. If it's the former, then you don't want the people who are attracted to it to be able to just go into it. So either way, the only way around that is like
Mm.
universal civic service security. Like um nobody in the United States is going to suggest something like that. Even like people who call for abolishing the police are very hesitant to say, and we all have to replace them
Yeah.
collectively. Um
But and yeah, and I mean, I guess that's kind of like the victory of moving away from the draft, right? I mean, it would seem like you're going back. So, but why is it you were going to say that they don't prosecute cops in the US as much as they should?
because who's going to oversee the cops investigation? The cops. And
Hmm.
and what are the largest unions in the United States? The police unions. Literally the largest unions in the US are the police unions.
So
Um,
yeah, the only kind of powerful slash active still.
yeah, so the largest unions in the US are
Actors Union
Yeah, I was
is
gonna say
doing
after
great.
police
The
is actors.
screen, yeah, they are doing amazing right now. Okay.
yeah, well I mean but it is interesting when you think about like the union victories you've heard of in America. It's always like sports,
Directors Guilds.
Sports nowadays, maybe teachers back in the day,
teachers,
perhaps.
yeah, not
Teachers
right
Yeah.
very
now.
long time ago, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Teachers about a decade ago, and even then they didn't really win. That's not talked about, but
Yeah, they got like
um
50
I
cents more per
remember
hour.
I remember them losing during Obama or something. I remember something.
yeah, yeah, they well, I mean they really lost bad in Wisconsin, but like in general,
Yeah.
the assault on the teachers unions was by both parties. Um
Yeah.
and while the teachers unions are still attached to the Democrats overwhelmingly at the national level, I mean,
Mhm.
why else would the head of the the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers Unions, go to Ukraine?
Hmm.
Um,
Well,
the in general, it is a declining union. Um, Unions in America, and
and
this
it's
is
funny you
something that,
mentioned sports. Sorry. I mean, it's
yeah,
really funny how like these big sports, like really rich athletes, even they have like the craziest unions and like the best, really good protections against their sports leagues and all this. It's kind of funny.
Yep. I I don't want to sound like I'm against sports unions
Mhm.
or this and that and the other, but most of these unions are guild unions. Um, so what do I mean by that? Like they only represent certain positions within even an industry. They're not even
Yeah.
representing the entire industry.
No, 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 not at
Um,
all. They represent
Oh yeah,
specific
the
league, so like, like 1,000
yeah,
people or something.
right,
above $1 million per year salary. We are
right.
we represent.
Um,
We support
and
them.
and with the teachers unions and a lot of the other public sector unions, they're legally prohibited from striking in a lot of states and stuff like
Hmm.
that. So,
Yeah, it's
and
crazy.
this is even true for like nurses unions. It's true for certain infrastructure unions, even if they're not ungoverned by the government, like the railroads,
No.
which really shows where a lot of this is. Um, the the factory unions, um, they kind of died in 2007. And there was a increased unionization push in the early aughts around Occupy, and it was actually successful. We saw an increase of in both absolute numbers and in percentage of the workforce of unions. What's ironic about this right now is now that the left cares about this, because it really kind of didn't talk about this that much during the actual union increase. It did. I'm not gonna say it didn't at all, but it wasn't the primary focus at all. Um, Now that it really cares, and it's kind of, and you even have Democrats talking about this rebirth of unionism, it's statistically false. Like, we've actually seen a decline in unions in the last 4 years. The exceptions are what everyone focuses on. So that's a few Amazon
Yeah, I was
warehouses,
gonna
not even
say.
all of them.
Yeah.
Starbucks, which
Yeah.
which I'm not saying that service workers don't deserve unions. In fact, I actually like that's a big part of America we need to like really fight for. I absolutely believe that. But I want to point out that like if you have 600 union applications and 400 of them are Starbucks because they're 20 people at a time, that's a completely different thing than unionizing even an Amazon warehouse. And it's hugely different from unionizing industrial workers where
Because
you
you're
would
saying
get,
there's so few, you mean?
yeah, there's so few per person. And it's and because of, like this might work with with Starbucks because it's corporate, but McDonald's unions, those are franchised. So the owner will be a different contract with a different
That's very true. Didn't
with
think.
both two different corporate leaderships, both the local owner corporate leadership and the McDonald's corporate leadership to deal with. Good luck figuring out how to unionize that in an effective way.
I think you're the first person who's even ever put McDonald's and Union together. I don't think I've ever heard McDonald's Union.
Yeah, so this is something I just well, I mean, if we're talking about Starbucks, we should be talking about McDonald's, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a good
So,
point.
so this is something that I think people in America, when they hear about this like union militancy, um, they need to be honest with themselves because most people aren't in unions and they don't have access to it. And the unions that are growing, okay, what's keeping the American Auto Workers Union alive? Teaching assistants in universities, like that's
I,
who like
no, it's
United Auto Workers Union is representing tons of college TAs now. And here's the problem with that. College TAs have that
oh, I,
job for 6 years. There's no way that they can have that job longer than that. It's a
Yeah.
temporary job. Now, again, they deserve union representation, but as a way to build union power, all you're getting is dues.
Hmm.
Like, and yes, you
yeah.
can represent them on contracts, but you're not building up skilled union people.
Yeah.
Um, it's not going to be long-term union membership games. It's a short-term grab for people who need it, but it's not a solution to the situation. And if you hear about strikes and labor organizations and whatnot in the United States right now, it's that stuff. The strikes of industry, they've failed and they have not been helped by the Biden administration. There are some rules that I've seen floated um, that the Biden administration are going to try uh, that push back some kind of very limiting rules that were administrative decisions or not legal decisions in the 80s. And so that's good, but by and large, this whole Biden is a union president thing is a
I mean,
joke.
that's just ridiculous.
Yeah,
That
that's
is for sure.
hilarious.
So, sorry, I'm gonna have to leave, unfortunately, like 10 minutes or so. So, Sam, I wanted to see like if there were anything specific you want to ask, maybe really current elections. I don't know, Derek, how much you're
Yeah,
into the whole RFK and all that,
we
or
just
I
whatever
follow
you
it.
want.
sure. Yeah,
Oh, if you want to talk about RFK and Cornell West,
I
there's
think that would
two
be
yeah.
good.
observations.
Yeah.
There's two
Whatever you
observations. Yeah. What are my positions?
Or like, yeah, just your thoughts, of course. And
no, yeah, whatever you like to talk about, exactly.
So RFK is very popular amongst some Marxists who are anti-establishment, but also hugely popular amongst uh, Alex Jones types because
oh
he's
yeah.
anti-vaccine, because he will flirt with conspiracy theories, even though he's very pro-Israel, stuff like that.
Do you think right
What?
now, if they just held election, sorry, if they just held election and all adults could just go and vote without party affiliation and being registered Democrat and all this, do you think RFK would win?
No,
No?
no, I don't. No,
To
I don't.
me, it seems like it. I mean, but yeah, maybe I'm just.
I think it's because if you follow like left-wing
Online.
media,
Hmm.
you would get this idea that he's more popular than he is. And if you follow a dissident right-wing media, he's
Hmm.
more popular.
Yeah.
Um,
I think
his
Biden is still has.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Biden and Trump are still the two
Oh
most
yeah.
popular
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true.
by far. Um, if if people could vote whatever they want, I highly doubt any of these candidates would be the candidates they pick. Like if people got to pick who they wanted for the candidates in the United States, I don't think a single one of these major candidates would be who the average American picked.
What kind of people do you think they would go for?
That's the question I don't know.
Mm.
Like one of the things that you see in the U.S. right now, and this is actually part of how Trump came to power, is just like there's a very much like exhaustion and fuck you-ness to the electorate. It's just like
Definitely.
we kind of want to throw anybody out who's empowered no matter what. And
Hmm.
this has been a trend going all the way back to the end of the Bush administration. And the kind of the realization that the war on terror was kind of a scam. But what have we been served since then? Just different kinds of scam, and they're even similar. Like it's constant fear-based baiting. So it's like, okay, well, the fascists are going to get you, the disinformation people are going to get you, and it's not that it's just like, yes, there are really Islamic terrorists. Yes, there are really fascists out there. Yes, there's a fascist undercurrent to American culture going all the way back 150 years, even. But I want to point out to you that it's never been a majority. And living totally in fear of it as the primary thing you're afraid of, in some ways, seems to actually empower it. Um, and it constrains you from doing anything about it. One of the things that I think we see a lot right now, the reason why people are more interested in RFK than they are in, say, Cornel West, is because RFK decided to run as a Democrat.
Hmm.
Because people really have been so burnt by the 90s and aughts attempts to change the parties from it out and run a third party candidate that they have just accepted that you have to do that, but within the Democratic Party itself. And what options do you have? Right? Like, so you get like the Democratic Party uh, is not allowing, a debate to happen. We're not going to have a RFK Biden debate. Um, and it's internal backbench, so people who are younger, non-boomers, they're weak. There's not a single candidate in the Democratic Party. Like you had this massive candidate range with Bernie and Biden. If you think back to 2019, and Biden's not a good candidate,
But he
but there was
beat
nobody
all the other.
better. Yeah. Huh?
He beat all the other ones to the
Right.
ground. Yeah,
He did, but
Pete
he
Buttigieg was his ass was handed to him.
right. But here's the issue with that. Why? It was pretty clear that the Democratic Party establishment was willing to back a bunch of horses to get someone fresher and younger than Biden. And when it didn't, they dropped out and consolidated, and Biden kicked the rest of them's ass.
Well, as long as it wasn't
Right?
Bernie, really.
Yeah, is it anybody but Bernie
Yeah.
and maybe
Of course,
Elizabeth
yeah.
Warren? We don't really want her either, but
Whatever, yeah.
she might be acceptable. But and I mean, I do want to point out that like that does tell you how much the left has shifted in the Democratic Party itself because um in the aughts, coming up to I remember when Elizabeth Warren was like doing her speaking tour, that was the most left-wing thing that came out of a Democrat's mouth was what was
Mm.
coming out of Elizabeth Warren's mouth in 2007, 2008. Um, so there has been a big shift in that way. But has it actually affected the party at all? No. That's the thing that I think people need to look at. And the problem that we have in America, and this will be my last thought and something for your audience to think about, is we have lived through a period with this before. And that was the mainstreaming of the new left outside of various communist movements, anti-war movements, etc., into the Democratic Party after the McGovern campaign. That gave us Nancy Pelosi and Gene Kwan and uh, Rob Reich. And I mean, these people were Maoist and Trotskyist in the 60s and 70s. They became like, as I like to point out, in the 80s, Nancy Pelosi was AOC.
Even more
Um,
hardcore, maybe.
yeah, actually, she was. And at least, like, not on stances taken, but as to where she was relative to where the party was at, yes. And yet, what are we seeing now? Like, one of the things I'll say, if anything, we've learned from the squad that they've sold out faster than the 70s and 80s
It's
versions of this.
ridiculous how fast.
Like,
That was really like, come on, at least let it just for one term. Come on,
yeah,
that
I
was
mean,
ridiculous.
I
Yeah.
remember just saying like about AOC, and I got in so much trouble for this in 2018. But I was like, look, she's more Ted Kennedy staffer than she is DSA. Like, and you need to know that because you're going to get burnt. And
You
there
were
was
right
this,
there.
there was a real resistance to it, and then people like Jimmy Dore picked it up, and really, I mean, and to be fair, Jimmy Dore hit it harder than me. I don't love Jimmy Dore's positive politics, but he's been kind of right about what a lot of the Democratic Socialists are actually going to do. And I remember sitting down in 2018, 2019, and trying to explain to people, I want you just to look at the funding model, okay? You're AOC. You believe. I'm not going to assume she's cynical. You believe everything you're saying, but you got to make compromises to make any kind of change at all. Who has money? The DSA or the Democratic National Convention's donor base? That answers your question right there. Can you protect
Yeah.
AOC from the DNC with votes? Oh no, you can't. Can you?
And in a 2-year election cycles, which
Yeah, in a
is
2-year
the
election cycle, you can't do it.
craziest. Yeah.
Like, so you're making all these big promises off of 4, then 6 junior Congress people and 1 senator. And you've built none of the infrastructure up to support them. You don't have a mass base to protect them, and you don't have enough money. What do you think is going to happen? Like, and to me, it was obvious. Like now, 20-year-old me, no, it wouldn't have been obvious. But I've been at this game now for 2 decades and more than that. And I just looked at that and I was like, this is like Obama, but dumber. And what did the Democrats learn from that? What did they learn from Obama? The example of what they learned from Obama is Lori Lightfoot and Kamala Harris, which is nothing burger politicians of color who have no organic constituency and try to appeal to everyone and appease nobody. And while that kind of worked with Obama because of his
Definitely not
natural
working now,
charisma,
it seems.
It hasn't worked with anybody else.
No.
And also, I mean, I remember
I don't know.
Jacqueline just ran.
Kamala is just, I don't know. I think you're underselling Kamala. I've heard she's among the autistic community, among a lot of people.
Well, I
Sorry,
mean,
she's
she
very
is like she
loved.
pulls Kamala Harris pulls about as well as Dan Quayle. That's the last vice president who pulled as badly. Um, my my feeling is the Democratic Party is actually learning from this, but it has no idea what to do with this information. Because the other problem, okay, now progressive candidates are running in city governments, but these progressive candidates can't do anything because they're limited by municipal bonds, they're limited by state legislatures, they've overpromised and things they can't deliver. And then you have stuff like reparations committees in California suggesting that they get billions of dollars off of local taxpayer money to like 10,000 black people at most, probably more like 100 or 200. And it's like, well, that's not going to help the great majority of black people, and it's going to turn everyone in the community against them. Why are you even messing with that? And of course, even Democrats laugh it off. It's not going to happen, but it's just like that's what the Democrats learned, and what they are seeing now is that's not even working with people of color. It's they're in 2020, the biggest voter increase for Biden was college educated white men slightly inching more towards the Democrats. All right. And one of the things I'm gonna say, we've had record voting attendance for the past 3 election cycles. So Obama, Trump, Biden. I don't think we're gonna have that anymore. I think that's gonna stop. Particularly when like, well, we have two 80-year-olds. Like, who gives a shit? Like,
I
and
mean,
so
even
what? Go ahead.
Trump is the attractive 8-year-old. Like, I think the next time yeah, nobody's gonna like even follow what's going on. Who's running? Yeah,
Right.
right
It's like
now.
what? Yeah. Once you have, because DeSantis is not popular. I mean, DeSantis is too mean. He's meaner than Trump. But he's also more synthetic, more
Such
of
a
a
loser.
creature. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
he's
I
a
mean,
loser, yet he can dominate his state. But the thing is, Florida
Yeah.
politics is not the United States politics, and that's.
mhm.
But the Democrats have set on their laurels because in 2022 they did better than expected and didn't totally lose the House. They only mostly
Mhm.
lost the House um, in uh, in the midterms, and that's because college educated people are now more democratic and they're more likely to vote in the midterms. Um, but all those trends are reversing. Less and less Americans are going to college. The college debt burdens are too high, and people no longer see the trade off as worth it. Um, uh, uh, White people are beginning to pick up conservative backlash again, and that's to be expected. The last time conservatism was this popular was the Obama administration's first term. I mean, that's it. It'll fade out, but because it's on margin, it's a very small percentage of people going that way. But that's enough to throw some stuff their way. And the general election population is going to be different than the midterm election population. Does that mean we see Trump as
Definitely.
the next president? I don't know. I mean, like we haven't over 100 years, we haven't had a president lose and then come back. It has happened once before in U.S. history, but the one thing I've been telling people is like, don't listen to Nate Silver entirely because we've been seeing lately that the statistically less probable thing has been more likely to happen lately because more people are fed up and they're just in general fed up. They don't really give a shit about the ideology or
Party.
where people are headed. But the other thing is, I said this in 2019, and I guess this is my last thought for you guys. The left in the United States after Occupy, when it went back to the Democratic Party, did not change the Democratic Party. It saved the center of the Democratic Party because at the end of the day, it is not willing to blame the popular front because it is afraid of Trump. And why is it afraid of Trump? it's hard for me to actually say because so little of the policies Trump
Are any
initiated have
different?
been reversed by Biden. Yeah. And they weren't that different than Obama policies either. Some of them were. I mean, some of them were way more brutal. But if you even look at stuff like accelerating tariff wars with China, Biden kicked that up more than Trump did.
Yeah, I'm just right now this week. There's a bunch of stuff in the news about that. Biden doing similar things.
So
Yeah.
the one thing I'm like trying to tell people, like this whole your whole thing about everybody needs to fight the fascists is going to be hard to push when people do realize how little changed. Like it's the only thing that you have to argue off is Trump will be worse his second term, and he probably will. I mean, he has a bigger chip on his shoulder,
Jesus, yeah, it's
but
gonna be great.
the idea that American democracy is going to fall apart because of this, that's just not true, and it hasn't been true this entire time. I mean, people forget about this, but in 2007, Naomi Wolf, who's now kind of a weird conspiracy theorist in a bunch of ways, but this was her first way, was predicting that even though she wrote a whole book on this, that even though Barack Obama won the election, that there was no way the neoconservatives were going to let him assume power, and that there was going to be some kind of coup, and Bush would be installed as our God emperor. And that's been like erased from progressive memory entirely. It was a minority position, but it was not an insignificant one. And it's just been, we forgot that anyone even said it. And you guys are old enough to remember that. Like
Oh, yeah,
2008, you were still adults, probably, or at least close.
just about.
Just became adults.
Yeah, just
Um, yeah, although
but
you're not Americans, right?
No,
Yeah.
no.
I'm Canadian. I'm
All right.
Canadian, so close, but yeah. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Closer
American
proximity of
politics,
him.
yeah, is what we
Yeah.
know best, probably. Except, I mean, Sam
Well,
really into Iran, but that's a different story.
yeah, that's different, and that makes sense, right? And I am
Yeah.
really into Iran, but I don't speak Parsi, so I have no idea like if I'm actually getting accurate information.
No, well,
Um,
next time we have to talk
Probably
about
you
that.
are actually. Yeah, the information in English and Iran are much more accurate than the information in Persian. It's much more muddled. But thank you. I'd love to have you back to talk
Yeah,
about
we have to do it again there.
multipolarity and theory. Love to talk about
Do you
those
go
two
back
as
to
sure.
well if you have the
teaching
time.
next week or
Yeah.
things like that? I mean, when the
Yeah, so
semester starts, I guess.
I have a
Uh,
weird teaching job now. So like I work strange hours because I do a hybrid program. I go
okay,
and work with students who are in the public school but can't attend public school.
I
So my
see.
hours are slightly more I mean, they're still pretty rigid, but they're slightly more flexible for people who wonder how I sometimes do stuff in the day.
Mhm.
Um, but that's what I do now. And I teach at a local community college. So and I run my own podcast, which you can check out at Varn Blog.
Definitely,
Um,
people should do. We'll leave links below. But yeah, I guess we'll
Yeah.
figure something out to definitely do
mhm.
it again. It's been really fun.
Yeah. And I just had this criminally underrated channel, I feel, because of the level of production value is very good. I feel like one of the highest, I think. At least the information there is very concise and fun and all that.
But your
So
channel has grown a
I think,
bit,
yeah.
no, recently, or
Yeah,
because
it's grown a bit.
yeah,
Yeah.
It's
yeah,
grown a
because
lot.
yeah, I was looking at 4,000
But
something. I remember a while
yeah,
ago
it's
was a
still I would say.
yeah, but definitely.
Well, part of the problem is I don't monetize the YouTube channel because I don't want to be censored for what people say. I still go by community guidelines, but the community guidelines are less strict if you're not taking in money.
Yeah, but
Um,
do it. Don't worry about it. I mean, because all they do is just they demonetize that specific video. I mean, not all they do. It's a pretty big thing, but based on my experience,
all right.
at
Well,
least so far.
we'll see because
Does that affect algorithm?
I think it does.
Ah, I see.
I'm not
Uh,
sure. Yeah, because
but
sometimes
I'm
I
not
thought it
sure.
would, but sometimes I see some videos of ours that were demonetized that do as well or better than one that wasn't. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's a
who
mystery.
knows?
Who knows? Yeah, exactly.
Who
Who
knows?
knows?
But the algorithm gods are fickle, and I think that also breeds a lot of
Yes, very
paranoia.
Definitely.
yeah.
But okay, it's been great. Thank you so much, Derek. And
Thank
thank
you.
you, everybody, for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video. Thank you.